Hi, welcome to our viewers at Blogging Heads. I'm Julia Kamin, and on the other side of the screen, you're looking at Eric Alterman, who doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'll do one anyway. Eric's a Stanford-trained historian. That's right, Stanford. Right. He's a top blogger at Altercation, professor at Brooklyn College, and a writer of many books, one of which we'll be talking about today. I am Julia Kamin, and I'm a relative non-entity who runs a nonpartisan organization called citizenJoe. As I say, we're talking to Eric today. Eric, I don't know if this is kind of creepy, but last week I checked to see if you had a Facebook page, you don't, but I did come across, when I plugged your name in, a group, I don't know how typical it is on Facebook, but a group that hates liberals. So Eric is mostly famous as being a liberal champion, and Eric, yeah, you were listed up there with other liberal champions, Arianna Huffington, Al Franken, etc. And that group kind of goes to the point of the book that we're talking about today, and so y'all can see it. It's Why We're Liberals, and in many ways is kind of a defense of liberalism. So I guess we'll start off, Eric, since we're talking about your book, if you want to tell everybody what's it all about.
What's it all about?
Yeah. Do you have a 2-minute synopsis, or you just want to
I guess I
in?
do. I did the tour already.
Okay.
Thank you for that introduction. One thing I want to say about Facebook is that I hate what it's done to the word friend. That's one reason I won't join. There's many reasons I won't join, but, I have actual friends, maybe not that many. Maybe they don't really like me, but they know who I am, They've met me, they've seen me. They don't, reach out to me and, quote, friend me. It's not a verb, for Christ's sake. Now that I'm professor of English, I get to, say things like that, even though I don't have an English degree. I have a history degree. So what's my book about? Thanks for asking.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty simple. 60 or so percent, between 55 and 70% of Americans take the liberal position on virtually every single issue. But only 20% of Americans call themselves liberals, compared to about 30 or so percent conservative. The reason for this, I would argue, is that the word liberal has been delegitimated, devalued, and associated with all kinds of horrible traits for the past 40 years, in part because liberals made some serious screw-ups in the 60s and 70s when they were a lot closer to power than they are today, and in part largely because the conservative machine has devoted tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to creating this exact situation, and that a very gullible section of the mainstream media has bought into it. And so an awful lot of what's treated as the implication of the word liberal has nothing to do with it. And yet it's been incredibly successful, because what conservatives are able to do is not argue issues on which they're a decided minority on virtually everything, but just tag their opponents as liberals and therefore, again, make their positions appear illegitimate. And they don't have to win arguments. They can just win them by calling them names, liberals. So what I'm hoping to do with this book is demonstrate the truth of what I've just said with, facts and figures and footnotes and historical examples and so forth, and rejuvenate the term so that people who hold this term can call themselves liberals proudly, and they don't have to run for the hills every time a conservative uses this term to describe them. And that way, we would break the bottleneck in our democracy of 55 to 70% of the people not getting the policies they say they want.
Cool. Well, one thing I want to start with, and this is actually not a complaint that I had with your book, as you know, or as reviewers should know, I did a review of Eric's book, and there's lots of great stuff in it. There's lots of stuff that I wasn't so thrilled about. But one complaint that I've heard others say, it's not mine, is that what's wrong with just the liberals or the left dropping the liberal term and picking up another one, say progressive? Why are we wedded to that term? Why don't we just kind of deflect the whole issue by calling ourselves something else?
Well, personally, I like the term. I'm attached to it because the word progressive for me has historical associations with which I'm uncomfortable. The original progressives were very racist, and the term, as it's understood in its most recent usage, the difference between liberals and progressives were that liberals were anti-communist and progressives were not. And I think liberals were right to be anti-communist, and progressives were wrong not to be. And so I would have picked the liberal side in the 40s and 50s when the two terms were sort of in competition. Today, the term progressive is much more popular than the term liberal. You're right. If you take the same positions and attach the progressive label to them as you did instead of the liberal label, you double the number of people who are willing to associate themselves with it. You go from 21% or so to 22% to 41% with the exact same positions. So it's tempting.
Yes.
But my argument would be is that you can't run away from the liberal label. That your opponent is going to call you liberal because it's such an effective slur, and the media are going to say, what's your response? And if you don't have a good response to that, the way John Kerry didn't, the way Al Gore didn't, then you're going to lose because you're going to look like a wimp, someone who won't stand up for themselves, someone who can't be trusted to make up their mind about anything. It's always been my view that Americans are much more forgiving of what you actually believe, as long as you believe in something. And I'd be hard-pressed to identify what it was John Kerry believed in as a fundamental measure. So I think Barack Obama, and I've been arguing this for quite a long time, should embrace the liberal label, but define it. Don't let others define it for him. Define it himself, the same way John Kennedy did in 1960. That was really the last politician who did so effectively.
Well, let's get to that, because that is, again, a part that I really like. You did bravely define liberalism, which you don't see people doing much these days. And do you want to give a go on that and kind of say it's, as you point out, it's a complex term, but I think you pulled the threads together.
Yeah, well, for me, I take 10 pages to define it in the book, and that's too long. It's certainly too long, for the American media. Maybe it's possible to do justice to it in this wonderful forum that my friend Bob has created. But I tend to define it in historical terms. The original meaning of classical liberalism, it means an embrace of the Enlightenment. So what the Enlightenment meant was that there are no greater powers than mankind's reason. That people are free to believe what they want to believe, to follow their own hearts and minds, to be who they want to be. That the church, that the king, later on that the dictatorship of the proletariat, that the historical forces that define you don't have to define you. That people can embrace truth as they understand it. Now that's an extremely wide tradition. It includes Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Milton Friedman, as well as the people we think of liberals. Interestingly, it doesn't include George Bush, and it doesn't include Osama bin Laden. Those people all speak as if they are getting orders from a higher power, and that higher power is more important to them than their own reason. So that's why, for instance, we don't have a decent stem cell research policy in this country.
So would you say that liberalism is anti-ideology?
Yes, I do. I think liberalism... Oh, well, here, let me just finish the second part, because that'll make it clearer. There are all these rights that are implied with liberalism. And where classical liberalism diverges from contemporary liberalism, and where the classical liberals who we think of today as conservatives diverge from contemporary liberalism, that took place around the time of the New Deal, when liberals said, we believe in all these rights, but they're meaningless unless they're actually operational. John Dewey, the philosopher, explained that liberalism is meaningless unless it implies the power to actually do things that are not just being paid tribute to as ideals. Now, a lot of things can get in the way of exercising your right to follow your dreams, to be who you want to be, to your right to begin in society as an equal to anyone else. In the 1930s, it was largely big business. It was trusts. It was monopolies. And so liberals look to the federal government to be a balance against those powers, and also labor unions, to allow people to make good on their God-given rights or natural rights. Now, conservatives basically take the position that you have these rights, but you're on your own. Mm-hmm. Liberals take the position of you have these rights, and the government or some other power, labor unions, voluntary associations, whatever it is, needs to be put in place to make these rights meaningful, because society doesn't work all by itself. The market is not the be-all, end-all of human existence. And so liberals have, since the 1930s, been creating all kinds of structures to give greater meaning to the same freedoms that both they and conservatives profess to admire. Now, the big problem with this is, where are the limits of this? What is it right and proper for our political system to provide for people, and what is too much? And there's no clear answer to that, except for the fact that a lot of things the government just can't do. And I would say that in the 60s and 70s, liberals didn't pay enough attention to this question. That they insisted that because they believed in certain things, it was therefore the job of the government to provide them. And they screwed up because, A, there was a lot of disagreement on this point, and B, there are a lot of things the government can't provide. And so what's happened since the 60s and 70s, as in my view, is that liberals have come back down to earth and done a much better job of defining what government is for and what government is not for. But a big difference between liberalism and conservatives as ideologies is that conservatives believe that government is ipso facto a bad thing. The less you have of it, the better. Liberals don't have a view one way or another. But if government is the best way to accomplish something, then why not? If it's not, then that's fine too.
Well, I mean, I'll get back to this later. It's interesting, the question, what are the defining values of conservatives versus liberals? I was watching Colbert Report the other day with George Will, and it was interesting, he made the distinction, after he made some crack about liberals being confused, he made the distinction between conservatives and liberals, saying that conservatives believe in liberty and liberals believe in equality, which I thought, like, hey, that's kind of fair, but it sounds like what you're saying more is that liberals don't believe in equality as much as opportunity.
Yeah, I watched that too. Actually, George Will is a very good example of a classical liberal. Mm-hmm. He's not a conservative. I mean, he's not a conservative in the sense that George Bush is a conservative. So he's a conservative in our contemporary parlance, but he's really a classical liberal. I would say that George Will was slandering liberals by saying they believe in equality. They don't. Marxists believe in equality. Mm-hmm. Liberals believe in equality of opportunity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And conservatives like George Will believe in the liberty to starve, the liberty to be exploited, the liberty to, the liberty to get polluted, and so forth. In other words, there are all these problems created by the libertarian view of society that it would be great if society worked in the textbook fashion that conservatives say it does, but it doesn't. And so there are all these problems. Pollution is an obvious one. If you have companies that don't have to follow laws, in terms of regulation, all kinds of people are going to get injured. Okay, so you need limits on that. Now that's anti-conservative. It's not anti-liberal. Liberals don't believe, by definition, in limiting the freedom of conservatives. They believe in the reality of pollution, the reality of worker injuries, the reality of exploitation. So, I think conservatism is a deeply ideological creed as it's currently constituted, whereas liberalism today is quite pragmatic.
Well, this is one of the difficulties I had reading your book, and I think one of the difficulties in general when we're talking about conservatives and liberals is the same way that liberals are mischaracterized. I wonder, are conservatives mischaracterized too? Yes, we can say they're anti-government, and I have some libertarian friends that are scarily just plain old anti-government, but is another way of saying that they realize what you realize is that you've got to be careful whenever the government gets involved, because sometimes they're going to take off more than they can chew, and they might, mess things up. So aren't they just being cautious?
Would that were the case. Look at FEMA and Katrina, okay? There were this Brownie fellow who was formerly the head of the Arabian Horses Association or something. he had a hearing when he was being confirmed, and there was hardly anybody there. The hearing went very quickly, and he explicitly said, "Look, dudes, I'm a conservative, and I think FEMA is too good. I think FEMA works too well. I don't think it's appropriate ideologically that the government have these resources at its disposal. I think that these issues ought to be privatized, and therefore I'm going to go and destroy FEMA." Now, he said it more politely than that, but I'm not mischaracterizing the message of what he said. And he went and did it. So when you saw what happened in Katrina, when you saw the government's response in Katrina, that was the natural function of the ideologically conservative view of government, that the government ought not to be able to respond to the places where government is definitely needed. Now, government's not needed everywhere, but it's sure as hell needed in disaster response. Yeah. And yet there's no place for that in this version of conservative ideology.
Well, let's look at, because is it possible that there are different versions of conservative ideology? And
of course there are.
And
sure.
And I want to kind of get this, like when we're looking at who are the conservatives, I mean, is it possible, and I think actually the conservatives or the Republicans are suffering because there are so many different versions of conservatism that they're trying to round up into one party, but is it fair, like, are there conservatives that have legitimate values that you respect, and what would those be?
You know, I consider myself to be a conservative in some respects because I have a lot of respect for the way society is and how difficult it is to change things. And the people, some of the people that I have the least amount of respect for are radicals on both the left and right who think they can just legislate or declare that people will behave in a different way tomorrow than they did today. This happened in the 1960s with race when liberals, motivated by very good causes, I think, decided that the day after tomorrow white people aren't going to be able to discriminate against black people in any way anymore. And so they changed all kinds of laws that were attempting to change people's hearts and their behaviors in ways that were not really subject to laws. And these backfired. And now, in many respects, with regard to race, we have a worse situation than we did before these laws were passed. The neocons did exactly the same thing with foreign policy. They said, we're going to invade this country and get all these people to change their behavior all over the Arab world once we show them how tough we are and how wonderful we are and how great our system is. George Bush, the official foreign policy of the United States, was to announce that there was a single solitary way of organizing your society. That's actually in that defense guidance document or foreign policy guidance document. And that's just crap. That's ridiculous. And so the lack of respect, which is the bastion of conservatism, the respect for the way things are, the organic way in which things have developed, that was evident in among liberals in the 60s and 70s, is now migrated to conservatives. And, you know, they think that they can change the world. Newt Gingrich started it this way. The neocons have continued it, and it's just outrageous. And they're not entitled to the term conservative, but they've managed to run off with it in part because the real conservatives didn't have any good ideas. They were quiet, or else they just didn't have good political organization. But I think if you read the magazine The American Conservative, which I have differences with naturally. You don't?
No, but...
Well, I think there's good and bad in it, but I think that their critique of neoconservatism would be no different than mine. Except maybe the Pat Buchanan part would put more emphasis on the Jewishness of it than I would.
So I have tons of questions for you. I'm trying to figure out which one I want to ask next. Let's go like the big thrust of one of the big thrusts of your book, which you've talked a lot about already, which is there are like two things that kind of led to the defaming of the term liberal. One was the liberals themselves and how they got kind of ahead of themselves and too idealistic.
The way I put it is that they didn't. Sorry, I just want to correct that.
Yeah.
I mean, it may read that way, but what I felt is that liberals were so interested in their own good intentions that they didn't pay enough attention to the means with which they were achieving their goals, and that this created a backlash which, in many respects, was deserved.
And so,
Sorry, go ahead.
And then at the same time, there was these conservatives that came together, and this is the other thing that I guess a lot of others. I have some conservative friends, and they love calling themselves part of the vast right-wing conservative conspiracy, and get a chuckle. But is it is there a way to kind of define this group, or when you talk about a conservative movement that came together, like, how much is it a coherent movement? How much is it people that just happen to have similar interests and are fighting for their interests? I mean, is there anything? I don't think you use the term conspiracy, but how much is it a strictly defined group?
Good question. Well, I mean, the word conspiracy is a deeply annoying phenomenon in this term, in this context, because there is vast conservative movement. It doesn't need to be a conspiracy.
Right.
There's no reason to conspire. It's all, if you read Grover Norquist, who I think is an incredibly smart fellow, if you read what he writes, he lays everything out in advance. He says, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. That's not a very good conspiracy.
Right.
The conservative movement today, or the modern conservative movement, is made up of largely of three components: the Christian right, big business, and the neocons. There are other groups, but those are the groups that are most important. The old-fashioned ideological anti-government conservatives, I would submit, are very weak in this context. The Ron Paul people, they're fun, they're interesting, but they don't have much power. I would submit that all three of these are not really conservative. The Christian conservatives are not conservative because they want an incredibly interventionist government with regard to personal behavior. They want the government in your bedroom. They want to rip families apart for their own ideological purposes, which is why they became so unpopular with, what's her name? That lady in a coma.
Terry Schiavo?
Yeah. They got no support at all for that position. Then the neocons are obviously not conservative. They're radicals. They're revolutionaries. And the big business people are not conservative. They're just sort of in it for themselves, by and large. There are exceptions to all of these cases, but that's the mainstream of all three movements. And you see that in each of these cases, that actually getting power, they don't act conservative. I mean, look how enormously George Bush has increased the size of government and the size of deficit compared to every Democrat before him. Every Republican administration has increased the size of the government relative to Democratic administrations since the Kennedy administration. If you want a smaller government, based on historical example, you want a Democrat, not a Republican. If you want better growth, you want a Democrat, not a Republican. And obviously the neocons have been a complete failure because everything they said was going to happen, the opposite has happened. The only people who've been successful, even from a self-interested standpoint, are big business. The Medicare bill, which is one of the most expensive bills ever passed, is going to benefit big business enormously at the expense of the rest of us. It's corporate welfare of a size that dwarfs what we used to think of as welfare. So I think that the Republican Party has become a vehicle for special interests, of which conservatives are a very small part. We use conservative as a kind of shorthand to refer to these groups, but historically speaking, they don't deserve the term. Well, you can change the meaning of terms if you want. So maybe we should use conservative to refer to them. But I don't think that they have anything in common with the historical writings of the great conservative writers.
Well, this kind of leads to another question. So people who vote for conservatives, or can we find another term for big business at all? Can we call them that instead of conservatives?
Well, I call them right-wing extremists.
Right. Okay, let's do that. The people who vote for them, and this is another question, are they voting for them because they're really being fooled by them, or are they voting for them because they do espouse values that have worth, that have merit? And I think it's also kind of a point that you make in your book too, that in some ways the conservatives are doing a good job because they are keeping on top of liberals when they go off the deep end, and they are bringing up concerns that liberals have kind of let fall by the wayside since FDR.
Neither of us can know the answer to this question as to why people have been voting for conservatives against what they say they want from government. I would argue it's because conservatives have been so good at changing the subject. what Barack Obama calls diversions and distractions. I basically share Tom Frank's view that conservatives have been able to exploit cultural distaste for liberals. This quote-unquote elitism issue is very, very important. And to my view, completely ridiculous, but nevertheless, it works. And so people don't get to examine their actual self-interest in the policies they're voting for because they're motivated by these resentments that have been stoked by conservatism that made some sense, I have to admit, in the 60s and 70s, but are ridiculous today. I mean, the idea that liberals are more elitist than conservatives is crazy. Conservatives go to exactly the same schools. They send their children to the same schools. They go to vacation in the same place. They live in the same place. They don't live in the flyover states. They don't want to live there. They live in Washington, New York, and L.A., and they have just as good a time. And yet, because they're, in my view, better at being hypocritical, they attack liberals for living exactly the same lives that they live. I mean, look at Laura Ingraham and Ann Coulter and John Podhoretz and the way that they're always sending Valentines to the heartland. How wonderful they are. Ingraham and Coulter, if I'm not mistaken, are both the children of Connecticut lawyers and are lawyers themselves and went to Ivy League schools. And Coulter was actually a year behind me in college.
But isn't that all superficial? I mean, don't all politicians and pundits do that? I mean, they go for the emotional stuff. They go for the team spirit. And isn't that a distraction? And don't liberals do that to some degree too?
I don't think they do it as much or as well. I think liberals keep trying to win elections on issues. I mean, look at Al Gore versus George Bush in that election, which, by the way, of course, Gore won. But what George Bush? What were his actual issues? He just said, "I'm a guy. I'm a good guy."
Right.
Gore was always talking about all these issues. He didn't say, "I'm a good guy."
Okay.
And so.
All right, so let's jump to Obama then, because actually when I was reading your book, or when I read Obama's race speech, I forget which I did first, it seemed as though there was a lot of simpatico between your views and what Obama is trying to say. But of course, the big criticism against him is that he's not talking about issues; he's talking about Gestalt. No, I know you didn't make the point about him not talking about issues.
No. I'm sorry. Our technician here made a noise, and I wanted to.
Okay.
I wanted to plead innocent to making it. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, but
do you want me to speak to?
No, isn't that a claim that can be made against Obama and a lot of other successful politicians? Is that they're good at? They should be avoiding the nitty-gritty issues, and they should be looking at larger discussions of values or the Gestalt kind of campaigns.
Yeah. Well, look. In this country, personalities are really important to a degree that they're not in other people's political systems. To a much larger degree. It's not they're not important, but they're much more important in ours. We have a celebrity-driven culture, and our politics reflects that. And so you've got to connect with people on a personal level. And so it's not completely crazy that we know so much about Reverend Wright, because it does say something about Obama's character, that he was so forgiving of the guy's nuttiness for so long. I'm not saying that should be off the table. But John McCain is running, again, he'll have to run a completely personal campaign. Because he's out of touch with Americans on every single issue, every single significant issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, he wants to continue the war. He wants to upgrade the war and increase the level of war, and increase the number of soldiers in Iraq, when roughly 70% of Americans want to be out of there yesterday. And that's his most important issue. He's also out of touch with regard to the economy and whatever else you want to talk about. Social issues, he's off the charts in terms of what Americans say they want. So the only way he can win is the same way that George Bush won, which is to change the subject to quote-unquote character. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, I think character is a legitimate issue. And I think values are important, because you could even make a sort of good political science-y argument for this, that the issues change. You can't predict what the issues will be, and so you need to know what kind of person is there, and then trust them to some degree. But I think that the way that our media allows quote unquote conservatives to define character is completely insane. I think that McCain's unwillingness to stand up to this anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish bigot.
Who's that?
Reverend.
Oh, okay.
Well, Hagee is obviously anti-Catholic. I would say he's anti-Jewish because he sees Jews merely as a player in his scheme for the coming of the Messiah. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't mind so much if Hitler kills a few million of them with regard to that scheme. And Ron Parsley, too, the guy in Ohio, who says equally objectionable things. I think that, and, if you want to look at McCain's character, he dumped his first wife. He had an affair with this other woman who happened to be rich and launched his career.
Yeah, I don't really want to look at his character.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that the way that I don't actually care about his character either. I don't care who my president sleeps with. But what I'm saying is that the way that the media defines character, when George Stephanopoulos and Charles Gibson went on and on, why aren't you wearing a flag pin? Why did you serve on a board with Bill Ayers? Why don't? Are you sure you hate Louis Farrakhan enough? These things are not relevant to the job that a guy will do as president, even if you believe character is fundamental to the way a person does president. So I think the conservatives have been enormously successful at working the refs, at getting the media to imbibe their definition of character, and it's not a definition that most people would accept. It's certainly not one that I accept.
Well, let's look at the media, and also, I don't know if we can kind of rope it in, look at the left's response to being, labeled liberal in their attempts to kind of hide from it. What's really going on there? Is it that they're just wimping out, or what are the kind of factors at play to make them kind of just go?
Why the media are wimping out?
The media
and
also the liberals, or if they're the same.
Well, we got to
distinguish
between the two.
Okay, let's distinguish between the two. So, you want to take
liberals have a real wimp problem. Uh-huh. I agree with the poet. It's not Robert Frost. It's Robert Lowell, who said liberals are the kind of people who won't take their own side in a fight. I think that liberals have a kind of Stockholm syndrome, that they've internalized much of the critique of them by conservatives, and that they think they're wimps, and that too many act like wimps. But I also think that the media elevate the wimpiest liberals, so that if you take a look at people like Nick Kristof in the New York Times, some people with Maureen Dowd, Tom Friedman, if you look at the many editors of the New Republic, a lot of these people have to say, well, I'm a liberal, but I hate liberals. And therefore I'm okay. You can trust me. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Maureen Dowd defines herself as a liberal, but I know that, for instance, the New York Times ombudsman told me he defined her as a liberal, and most people think of her as liberal because she does hate Bush. She loved the first Bush. She hated the second Bush. Mm-hmm. In any case, I think there's a tendency in the mainstream media to elevate these people who call themselves liberals but actually embrace conservative themes and memes. And that there is very little space for genuine liberals, like of the kind that, say, Harold Meyerson is in the Washington Post, or Frank Rich is in the New York Times. There are damn few of those. Now, why have the people in the media embraced conservative definitions of these issues? Does that address your question?
Yeah. Why do they fall in lockstep?
Why are they so good at this? Mm-hmm. I think, again, the media has bought into the right-wing critique that they're too liberal, and they're always looking to prove ways that they're not. I think the media were more liberal than the country up until the mid-1970s. And I think that the country, liberalism kind of went sour in the 1970s, and it was important to rethink it and readdress it and to call it on the carpet in a lot of important ways. But we're not living in the 1970s anymore. Mm-hmm. I saw a discussion with Joe online where Joe Klein, who calls himself a radical centrist, was asked to say, why do you hate liberals the same way you hate conservatives? And he does hate liberals. He thinks they're anti-American. And he said, well, I hate conservatives because they've screwed up the country, and look at Bush and look at the war. Okay, we all understand that. And he said, and I hate liberals because of busing.
What?
Busing hasn't happened since I was 10. And that was a damn long time ago, as you can tell by the gray in my beard. All of the things, all of this quote-unquote social engineering all of the arrogance of liberal positions really dates back, not all of it, but most of it, dates back to the 1970s and 1960s. And liberalism today is very different. It's much more pragmatic, it's much more about limits, and it's much more respectful of the cultural values of people with whom it disagrees. I mean, I support a woman's right to choose, even though I'm actually a little confused about the issue. As a moral issue, I support it because it's going to happen anyway. Right. Women are going to have abortions anyway, and I don't want only rich women to have safe abortions and poor women to have dangerous abortions. I think everybody, it's an issue of class for me and an issue of fairness. It's not really my business whether or not to tell a woman whether or not she should have an abortion. But I really admire the people who go out and say, I think this is murder, the same way that people in the anti-war movement said, I think the Vietnam War is murder, I think the Iraq War is murder, who are willing to put themselves on the line for what they believe in. I respectfully disagree with them, and I will fight them. But I won't say that they're jerks, or idiots, or puppets, or whatever. And I think that liberals did, in fact, act that way in the 70s, but no longer do.
Well, let's go there. I mean, actually, I do want to talk more about the media, but I'm also kind of conscious of the time, and there's so much more to your book, which we haven't even touched on. Again, what I liked about what you wrote about, there were a lot of lessons for liberals. And one of them was abortion. Another one was how liberals talk about Christian values or religious values. And the other one is how we deal with race issues. So I'm wondering, let's talk about the race issue, because that seemed to be kind of the meatiest. What are your prescriptions there, and do you think liberals are going to get it?
Yeah, well, race is real complicated. There's nothing more complicated. Mm-hmm. It's America's original sin, but I think racism lurks in all of our hearts, in all of our psyches. I find myself having racist impulses on occasion that I suppress, because I have all kinds of impulses
because you live in Brooklyn.
I suppress during the day. Actually, I live in the Upper West Side.
Oh, you do?
I teach in Brooklyn.
Okay.
But I think racism is kind of natural. It's just that everyone's afraid of the other. It's completely normal. Mm-hmm. But they're very easy feelings to exploit. It's very easy, like you see it all the time when people get in a fight, and then someone will toss race into it and call the other person a racist name as part of a way to trump them. Because when people get angry, they become smaller. They become more attached to their team. Mm-hmm. So when liberals told people that they had no right to be concerned that they were racists, if they were concerned about their jobs, their schools, their neighborhoods, they were actually turning them into racists. Because people said, look, imagine if you had a child going to a good school, and you were told that for the good of society or to make up for historic wrongs, your child was going to be bused for an hour to an inferior school. Mm-hmm. There's nothing racist about saying no way, Jose, to that. Okay? So, and yet these people were told by liberals that they were racist if they didn't make these sacrifices and if they didn't see their character of their neighborhoods changed and so forth. And that's politically crazy, because these people were the primary basis of the base of their Democratic Party. They were the white working class. That's the swing vote in elections. But B, it's also wrong and unfair, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that liberals need to, and as a society, I think we need to get beyond race. We need to transcend race. I thought Obama gave a great speech, but I wish we didn't have to talk about race so much. I wish that speech didn't have to be given. I think it would be really smart for Obama to embrace affirmative action by class rather than race. I think people can understand this idea of equality of opportunity based on economics. And I think you would achieve much of what you would achieve with affirmative action by race without creating all of the problems associated with affirmative action by race. And by the way, it's problems on both sides. It's problems with white people and black people. Racism is a problem that afflicts the victim and the perpetrator. So I just don't see any hope in our society for solving the race problem, and I think we ought to do our best to wash ourselves of it as much as possible. We'll never do it, but to jump to the term racist for someone who disagrees with you on something is, again, one of the things that people hate about liberals. And it's something that I think that had some merit and probably continues to have some merit today, because there are people associated with the left who still do this. But I think that those of us who are serious about A, winning, and B, also respecting our opponents have no business doing it.
So getting back to Obama and kind of your earlier prescription of, is he espousing equality of opportunity? Is that like the general gist of his values? And also, do you think that's the way liberals are going now, or that's the way America's going now? Is there hope for equality of opportunity?
I think the example of Obama being a black man is so powerful and so moving and so important that he really doesn't need to say anything about race anymore. I mean, his color says plenty. It says we've made enormous progress as a country. I mean, almost unthinkable progress, that a black man is right now the favorite to be the president of the United States. I'm not sure he ought to be the favorite, but he is. So I don't think he should talk about race. I think his mere presence is all that needs to be said. And I think he needs to reassure people that race is not at the center of his appeal. And I think, I don't actually agree with Obama's whole campaign line about how we're all in this together and we just need to unite and the problem is Washington. But I think it was a brilliant way both to run for president as a black man and to govern as a liberal. So I'm totally down with it, even though I'm not even sure he believes it. But I think that I think Obama does need to reassure people who see him representing blacks. There are a lot of people who just see the world literally in black and white. And I think one way I can think of doing that is coming out against affirmative action by race, which, by the way, is dead anyway, both as a legal and a political matter, and embracing it as class. I think there's an enormous, if you look at the economics of the past 20 years, all of the benefits of the boom that has just ended went to the top 1 to 5% of our society. Working people got zilch. Most of them have fallen back. I think there's an enormous class-based appeal that can be made. Let them call it class warfare. They're going to call it that anyway. To show white people and that we're all in this, that white people and black people are all on this together. It won't succeed completely. There'll still be people who won't vote for him because of his race, but he can signal to them that race is not first and foremost what he's about.
But is that where Obama's going? Is that where the Democrats are going? I mean, I know there are lots of groups out there who are, one under Brookings, who are looking at economic inequality and also economic insecurity issues. Are the Democrats going there? Can they go there? Can they make that the issue? Or, I assume that's where you want them to go. I mean, it seems it's very much right. That's kind of very FDR.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I have as much problems with the Congressional Black Caucus as any conservative does. I think they're doing a real disservice to their own constituents as well as to the country by defining their issues entirely in race terms and by creating these crazy districts where they have 90%, where they win by 90% majorities, and yet they're not willing to submit themselves to democracy, and we waste a lot of votes, and a lot more conservatives get elected as a result. I didn't vote for my own congressman, Charlie Rangel, who's a pretty good liberal in most ways, because I'm so offended by this. I voted for nobody. I didn't pull the lever for the guy, because I just really object to this old clubhouse black spoil system that operates in our politics. Now, it's not really Rangel's fault. He's a Harlem clubhouse politician. And that's the way our politics have been organized. Sorry, go ahead.
But isn't Rangel doing good stuff? I mean, is it, in terms of tax reform? Don't you? I kind of respect the guy that he seems to be looking at larger progressive socioeconomic issues. Or
well, for me, it was an easy thing because he's going to win anyway. It doesn't matter if I vote for him or not. He's created a district where he's got 90%. A crazy-looking district where there isn't any possibility of challenge. I live at the very bottom of it. I live on the Upper West Side. It goes all the way through Harlem, so he doesn't need me. But the problem that you were asking about originally is that, yes, people feel their primary identity is racial or ethnic, right? Jews are Jews and white people. Black people are black people first, and then they're whatever else they are. And or maybe, Dominican or Hispanic or Asian American. And I just think that's not useful. I think that should be something that's private rather than public and political. I'm pretty Jewish. I spend a lot of time being Jewish at home, and I study the Torah, and I send my daughter for a Jewish education and stuff. But I don't think it's that useful politically for me to be Jewish. I think I want to be an American or a liberal, whatever. So I think that it's definitely an uphill battle. But if Obama, look, black people are 12% of this country. If Obama is defined as the candidate of black people, he will lose, and any hope of a colorblind America will be dead. So there's really no choice in the matter, and I'm saying that affirmative action would be a wonderful way to illustrate it. And actually, Obama has said that he
affirmative
supports
action.
It. He hasn't.
Affirmative action, socioeconomic affirmative action, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Affirmative action by class.
All right. But I guess what I'm suggesting, and I don't know if this is really going on the other extreme, is that is there a reason the Democrats are kind of holding with these identity issues and not going to the real socioeconomic issues, talking about redistribution of wealth, because to a certain level the Democratic Party has been co-opted just almost as much by corporate America? Is there...
No, that's not completely fair. I think it has been corrupted to a significant degree, but not nearly the way Republicans have. No, I think it's because the Democrats have been corrupted by identity politics, and that it's very hard that people think of themselves as part of these small groups that are not part of a larger whole, and that Democrats think in terms of race and gender rather than in terms of class about themselves and about the way they do politics. And I think we've begun to learn. I don't actually think of myself as a Democrat. I think of myself as a liberal, which is actually part of the problem for Democrats. But I think that Democrats have begun to learn to work much better together over the past 8 years because of the catastrophe that's befallen the country as a result of their inability to do so. But I think that it's really a question of identity, and it's not so much a question of money. Of corruption by money. The Democrats are pushing a millionaire surtax right now, right? And that, if they were as corrupt as Republicans, they wouldn't do that. They are trying to get funding for veterans to have a GI Bill. If they were as corrupt as Republicans, they wouldn't do that. They would just get more money for Blackwater and for the, corporations. So I think, in part because the Republicans have become so extreme, and in part because the rebirth of liberal organizations like Move On, like the Center for American Progress, like the Liberal Blogosphere, and have made Democrats more progressive. That there is a real significant difference between these two parties when it comes to economics today, and I used to be one of those people who had trouble discerning the differences between the parties, but I think those days are long gone.
Okay, so just because we're getting towards the end of the hour. We want to kind of turn to, I guess, the big issue, the big problem that I had with your book. So if anyone's still listening, the big question I had when I was reading Why We're Liberals, and again, lots of value to it, is that it seemed to get distracted by a lot of, to put it bluntly, mudslinging at the conservatives. And the question that kind of came up when I was reading about this, and I don't know how aware you are, is that I was wondering about who your audience was with this book. And the reason I ask this is because I do think there was lots of great stuff in the book, lots of lessons to be learned by liberals. But I was wondering all the other stuff, all the kind of defending the liberal name by kind of turning around and lodging the same kind of criticism or criticism towards the conservatives as they were lodging towards liberals. What was the what's the value of that? Did you think?
Right before you said that.
Yeah.
Right before you said that, I was getting all ready to thank you for how kind it was of you to devote all this attention just to my book and ask me questions, let me answer them. I really enjoyed this, and then now you hurt my feelings. So I can't say that with quite the fervor I was about to. Listen, I do think that's unfair.
Okay.
And I would ask you for examples if we had more time, because here's what I did, and I think most of the reviewers actually have agreed with you, so maybe you're right and I'm wrong. But I think what I did is I said conservatives accuse liberals of X. Okay, liberals maybe are to some degree guilty of X, or maybe not. But in fact, the very conservatives leveling these charges are far more guilty of X than are the liberals. And so I think I try to do justice to whether or not there's any merit to the charge. Maybe I'm too nice to liberals. I probably am. But then I look at the conservatives, and it's not what Ann Coulter or Laura Ingraham or Bill O'Reilly or Rush Limbaugh do. I go to the evidence, I give you the footnotes, and I say, here's why I think the way I did it. Make up your mind if I'm right. Now, I don't think there's much name-calling in the book. I don't think there's much personal insults in the book. There's very little about people's personal lives in the book, except if it's relevant to them accusing other people of these same sins. So, like I said, I am enormously critical of the current crop of quote-unquote conservatives that run American politics today. I think a lot of them are dishonest and a lot of them are jerks. But I think I lay out the evidence, and you're free to disagree or not disagree. It's not name-calling, or as you say, in my view, mudslinging. That's how I think of it. That was the standard to which I tried to hold myself. Maybe I failed. But I'd be willing, I think, to defend just about all of it in those terms.
Yeah, I guess my wonder was the problem. Well, how much are you edited? Or who comes up with, like, for example, the titles of your chapters? Was that you?
I did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, just to use an example, the first one was the trouble that I had was, again, it's to the charge that Democrats are unpatriotic. I mean, I guess, in your defense, what might be going on in my mind is that the charge is ludicrous. And so, rather than saying this is a ludicrous charge, because it turns around and talks about all the reasons why conservatives are unpatriotic, which I guess I think both claims are equally not worth defending either way. But
I disagree with you. I mean, we just have a disagreement here. Yeah. I think the charge against Democrats liberals is an important one because it sticks and it's powerful and a lot of people believe it, and conservatives say it all the time without defining what they mean. And I say, okay, what does it mean to be patriotic? Let's define it. And then let's look at how each side manifests that definition. And by my definition of patriotic, the people who are leveling the charge do a much worse job of living up to these values than do liberals. Well, so I think it's a completely fair issue.
Well, then maybe it's a question of the audience then. I mean, who do you imagine is reading your books?
The book was written for two separate audiences. One is people who are liberals and have been beaten down and need to be bucked up with what one reviewer called intellectual vitamins. I like that term, even though I wouldn't have used it myself. And the other one is for the 55 to 70% of people who are liberals but don't know it, and who just need to be shown that their values are consistent with this word liberal. And so my hope, therefore, is to break through this logjam on the word liberal that prevents liberalism from occurring, because, as I said, I think the majority of the country is liberal, and they ought to be proud of it.
All right. Well, listen, I mean, that's kind
But aside from that one little thing, I really do appreciate your being so generous in terms of reading the book carefully and allowing me to talk about it at this length. It's really been one of the best opportunities I've had for doing it.
Oh, really? Well, I guess what I would have said is if I had been your editor, I would have kind of distilled the book out and done what we just did, which is, talk about, there are lots of great stuff there. And I think, lots of good tonics for liberals and, good vitamins for thinking. All right. So
well, thanks.
So I guess we'll call it quits unless there's anything we should add?
No, just thanks very much, and I enjoyed it, and see you around.
Okay, take it easy. Bye.
Bye-bye.